Hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode we're going to be reading the first part of the second chapter of Blackshirts and Reds. It's called Let Us Now Praise Revolution. The first part of this first part is going to be talking about how the U.S. and indeed any capitalist nations often intervene in revolutionary communist uprisings using violence, and it's going to give you a crash course in that. And then the second part of the first part is going to be about how these violent revolutions, they're never really instigated by the revolutionaries as far as the violence goes. They're mislabeled as violent revolutions, even though it's always the state inflicting violence upon the communist uprising and the revolutionaries. They always start with the violence. And then when the revolutionaries react violently, then they label it a violent revolution and then have their reason for quashing it. But it's never the revolutionaries who start it, but the state has no problem starting it, calling it a violent revolution, and then using that mislabeling as a reason to destroy, hundreds of thousands of people. So let's start here on page 23. Let us now praise revolution. For most of this century, U.S. foreign policy has been devoted to the suppression of revolutionary governments and radical movements around the world. The turn of the 20th century found the McKinley administration in a war of attrition against the people of the Philippines lasting from 1898 to 1902, with pockets of resistance continuing for years afterward. In that conflict, U.S. forces slaughtered some 200,000 Filipino men, women, and children. At about that same time, in conjunction with various European colonial powers, the United States invaded China to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion at substantial loss of life to the Chinese rebels. U.S. forces took over Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and in the following decades invaded Mexico, Soviet Russia, Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic and other countries, actions that usually inflicted serious losses upon the populations of these countries. The costs of counter-revolution. From grade school throughout grad school, few of us are taught anything about these events, except to be told that the U.S. forces must intervene in this or that country in order to protect U.S. interests, thwart aggression, and defend our national security. U.S. leaders fashioned other convenient rationales for their interventions abroad. The public was told that the peoples of various countries were in need of our civilizing guidance and desired the blessings of democracy, peace, and prosperity. To accomplish this, of course, it might be necessary to kill off considerable numbers of the more recalcitrant among them. Such were the measures our policymakers were willing to pursue in order to, quote-unquote, uplift lesser peoples. The emergence of major communist powers like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China lent another dimension to U.S. global counter-revolutionary policy. The communists were depicted as evil incarnate, demonized conspirators who sought power for power's sake. The United States had to be everywhere to counteract this spreading cancer, we were told. And we are still told. That sounds exactly like what we're doing with Russia right now, and China. So, still going on today. In the name of democracy, U.S. leaders waged a merciless war against revolutionaries in Indochina for the better part of 20 years. They dropped many times more tons of explosives on Vietnam than were used throughout World War II by all combatants combined. Testifying before a congressional committee, former CIA Director William Colby admitted that under his direction, U.S. forces and their South Vietnam collaborators carried out the selective assassination of 24,000 Vietnamese dissidents in what was known as the Phoenix Program. His associate, the South Vietnamese Minister of Information, maintained that 40,000 was a more accurate estimate. U.S. policymakers and their media mouthpieces judged the war as a mistake because the Vietnamese proved incapable of being properly instructed by B-52 bomber raids and death squads. By prevailing against this onslaught, the Vietnamese supposedly demonstrated that they were, quote-unquote, unprepared for our democratic institutions. In pursuit of counter-revolution, and in the name of freedom, the U.S. forces or U.S.-supported surrogate forces slaughtered 2 million North Koreans in a 3-year war, which that was like a vast amount of their population. I think it was something like a third of the population of North Korea we killed. 3 million Vietnamese, over 500,000 in aerial wars over Laos and Cambodia, 1.5 million in Angola, 1 million in Mozambique, 500,000 in Afghanistan, 500,000 to 1 million in Indonesia, 200,000 in East Timor, 100,000 in Nicaragua, combining the Somoza and Reagan eras, over 100,000 in Guatemala, plus an additional 40,000 disappeared, and over 700,000 in Iraq. over 60,000 in El Salvador, 30,000 in the dirty war of Argentina, though the government admits to only 9,000, 35,000 in Taiwan, when the Kuomintang military arrived from China, 20,000 in Chile, and many thousands in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Western Sahara, Zaire, Turkey, and dozens of other countries in what amounts to a free market world holocaust. Official sources either deny these U.S.-sponsored mass murders or justify them as necessary measures that had to be taken against an implacable communist foe. Anti-communist propaganda saturated the airwaves, schools, and our political discourse. Despite repeated and often fictitious reference to the tyranny of the Red Menace, the anti-communist opinion makers never spelled out what communists actually did in the way of socioeconomic policy. This might explain why, despite decades of red-bashing propaganda, most Americans, including many who number themselves among the political cognoscenti, still cannot offer an informed statement about the social policies of communist societies. The anti-red propagandists uttered nary a word about how revolutionaries in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua, and other countries nationalized the lands held by rich exploitative landlords and initiated mass programs for education, health, housing, and jobs. And I did an episode, guys, recently. Even Venezuela has, their housing program is amazing. They've invested millions in it. You've heard about the healthcare system in Cuba and the education system in Cuba. They did more for the COVID pandemic than us by a long shot. They created better vaccines, and they had such a wonderful healthcare system, which is nationally owned and run, that they were able to also produce and distribute their awesome vaccines throughout the world. So that's just a couple of, Red Menace countries. Not a word about how their efforts advanced the living standards and life chances of hundreds of millions in countries that had long suffered under the yoke of feudal oppression and Western colonial pillage, an improvement in mass well-being never before witnessed in history. No matter that the revolutionaries in various Asian, African, and Latin American countries enjoyed popular support and were willing to pursue a neutralist course in East-West relations, rather than place themselves under the hegemony of either Moscow or Peking. They were still targeted for a counter-revolutionary battering from opposing communists because they might be revolutionaries. It was a short step to opposing revolutionaries because they might be communists. The real sin of revolutionaries, communist or not, was that they championed for the laboring classes against the wealthy few. They advocated changes in the distribution of class power and the way wealth was produced and used. They wanted less individualistic advancement at the expense of the many and collective betterment for the entire working populace. Presumptions of power. Ruling classes throughout the world hate and fear communism not for its lack of political democracy, but because it attempts to establish economic democracy by building an egalitarian, collectivist social system, though they rarely come right out and say as much. This counter-revolutionary interventionist policy rests on several dubious assumptions that might be stated and refuted as follows. 1, quote, U.S. leaders have the right to define the limits of socioeconomic development within other nations, end quote. Not true. Under no canon of international law or any other legal stricture do the leaders of this country have the right to ordain what kind of economic system or mode of social development another country may adopt. No more right than do the leaders of other countries have the right to dictate such things to the United States. In practice, the option to dictate is exercised by the strong over the weak, a policy of might, not right. 2, quote, the United States must play a counter-revolutionary containment role in order to protect our national interests, end quote. This is true only if we equate our national interests with the investment interests of high finance. U.S. interventionism has been very effective in building neo-imperialism, keeping the land, labor, natural resources, and markets of the third world countries available at bargain prices to multinational corporations. But these corporate interests do not represent the interests of the U.S. people. The public pays for a huge military budget and endures the export of its jobs to foreign labor markets, the inflow of thousands of impoverished immigrants who compete for scarce employment and housing, and various other costs of empire. Furthermore, revolutionary governments like Cuba, Libya, Vietnam, and North Korea were and still are eager to trade and maintain peaceful relations with this country. These countries do not threaten the national security of the United States or its people, but the overseas interests of global capitalism. If allowed to multiply in numbers, countries with an alternative socialist system, one that uses land, labor, capital, and natural resources in collectivist ways, placing people over profits, would eventually undermine global capitalism. Number 3, quote, the United States has a moral obligation to guarantee the stability of nations that are undergoing democratic development but are threatened by revolutionaries and terrorists, end quote. In fact, most U.S. interventions are on behalf of corrupt and self-serving oligarchs and anti-democratic militarists who take power with or without the benefit of U.S.-sponsored showcase elections. Third world oligarchs are frequently educated at elite U.S. universities or end up on the CIA payroll, as do their police chiefs and military officers, many of whom receive training in torture and assassination at U.S. counterinsurgency institutions. 4. Quote, fundamental social change should be peacefully pursued within the established order of nations rather than by revolutionary turmoil, end quote. U.S. policymakers maintain that they favor eliminating mass poverty in poorer countries and that they are not opposed to the laudatory objectives of social revolution, but to its violent methods. They say that transformations must be effected gradually and peacefully, preferably through private investment and the benign workings of a free market. In fact, corporate investment is more likely to deter rather than encourage reform by preempting markets and restructuring the local economy to fit foreign capital extraction needs. International finance capital has no interest in bettering the life chances of third world peoples. Generally, as Western investments have increased in the third world, life conditions for the ordinary peasants and workers have steadily grown more desperate. This part is the most interesting part to me, you guys. It's called Whose Violence? People throughout the world do not need more corporate investments. Rather, they need the opportunity to wrest back their land, labor, natural resources, and markets in order to serve their own social needs. Such a revolutionary development invites fierce opposition from apostles of the free market, whose violent resistance to social change makes peaceful transformation impossible to even contemplate. Even in countries like the United States, where reforms of limited scope have been achieved without revolution, the quote-unquote peaceful means employed have entailed popular struggle and turmoil, and a considerable amount of violence and bloodshed, almost all of it inflicted by police and security forces. The last point frequently goes unmentioned in discussions about the ethics of revolutionary violence. The very concept of revolutionary violence is somewhat falsely cast, since most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling to reform. By focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchs to maintain the status quo, including armed attacks against peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests, torture, destruction of opposition organizations, suppression of dissident publications, death squad assassinations, the extermination of whole villages, and the like. And if I may, guys, this happens in America, but we're seeing it again in Ukraine right now. We're seeing death and torture of journalists. You know who I'm talking about. We're seeing mass arrests, and you're seeing Zelensky just took down a whole bunch of opposition parties and took down all of their opposition media and molded it into one big state media abomination. So for anybody that's standing up for Ukraine, just understand you're standing up for fascism, like I've always said. It fits this exactly. Most social revolutions begin peaceably. Why would it be otherwise? Who would not prefer to assemble and demonstrate rather than engage in mortal combat against a pitiless force that enjoy every advantage in mobility and firepower? Revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam, and El Salvador all began peacefully, with crowds of peasants and workers launching nonviolent protests only to be met with violent oppression from the authorities. Peaceful protest and reform are exactly what the people are denied by the ruling oligarchs. The dissidents who continue to fight back, who try to defend themselves from the oligarchs' repressive fury, are then called violent revolutionaries or terrorists, which this happens all the time in this country. You have content creators get called violent for just having, a truthful discussion about how the government is anemic. I've been called violent. People that are just YouTubers get called violent. We have journalists that get called violent just because they call out the oligarchs. For those local and international elites who maintain control over most of the world's wealth, social revolution is an abomination. Whether it be peaceful or violent is a question of no great moment to them. Peaceful reforms that infringe upon their profitable accumulations and threaten their class privileges are as unacceptable to them as the social upheaval imposed by a revolution. Reforms that advance the conditions of life for the general public are not as materially intractable or as dependent on capital resources as we have been led to believe. There is no great mystery to building a health clinic or carrying out programs for food rationing, land redistribution, literacy, jobs, and housing. Such tasks are well within the capacity of any state, if there is the political will and a mobilization of popular class power. Consider Kerala, a state in India where the actions of popular organizations and mass movements have won important victories over the last 40 years against politico-economic oppression, generating a level of social development considerably better than that found in most of the Third World, and accomplished without outside investment. Kerala has mass literacy, a lower birth rate and lower death rate than the rest of India, better public health services, fewer child workers, higher nutritional levels, thanks to a publicly subsidized food rationing system, more enlightened legal support and educational programs for women, and some social security protections for working people, and for the destitute and physically handicapped. In addition, the people of Kerala radically altered a complex and exploitative system of agrarian relations and won important victories against the more horrid forms of caste oppression. Though Kerala has no special sources of wealth, it has had decades of communist organizing and political struggle that reached and moved large numbers of people and breathed life into the state's democracy. Quote, despite its relatively short periods in the leadership of government, it is the Communist Party that has set the basic legislative agenda for the people of Kerala, notes Indian scholar V.K. Ramachandran. All of this is not to deny that still many people in Kerala endure unacceptable conditions of poverty. Still, despite low level of income and limited resources, the achievements wrought by democratic government intervention and propelled by mass action have been substantial, representing the difference between a modestly supportable existence and utter misery. Many third world peoples produce dedicated and capable popular organizations, as did the communists of Kerala, but they are usually destroyed by repressive state forces. In Kerala, popular agitation and input took advantage of democratic openings and in turn gave more social substance to the democracy. What is needed for social betterment is not International Monetary Fund loans or corporate investments, but political organization and democratic opportunity and freedom from U.S.-sponsored state terrorism. So I will continue the rest of this chapter later. We're going to read Free Market for the Few next. That's on page 31. Loving this book so far. Hope you guys are as well. Keep fighting that good fight out there.